One of the things that's often not talked about unity experiences, deep unity experiences, that not all the time, but it's not uncommon, that deep what precedes, sometimes immediately precedes a kind of unity experience is a death experience. I don't mean falling over physically dead, not, of course, not that, but a kind of what spiritual teachings have often called a kind of ego death. And we get all these ideas about what ego death is right up until a kind of ego death happens. And it's not really so much ego death, although there's a tremendous amount of the ego that can die, and the experience can be a very, sometimes, not always, but sometimes a very visceral experience where people really, really feel like they're actually dying. I know I did when this first occurred for me in my mid-20s. I was absolutely convinced I was physically dying. Fortunately, I was completely ready to, if that's what it took, to have the insights I was after. It was kind of a surprise to me that when I found out that if that's what it takes, okay, I'll die today. And I was kind of like, wow, I didn't know that I was willing to do that, but apparently I was. And sure, there was an experience of a death. I'm not going to describe it. I've described it before, but one of the reasons I don't want to describe it is, number one, people will often that hear it will then chase after the same experience. And experiences of ego death are very, very different from one to the next. They're very unique. So we don't want to be trying to duplicate anybody's experience. But sometimes ego death is just the transitioning from one perspective, the ego perspective, to the unity perspective. And the death part isn't really, almost not really experienced. It's just the transition. Because in essence, ego death, especially ego death that precedes unity, it's actually a transition experience. You're leaving the kind of one domain of consciousness, the conditioned domain of consciousness, into the unconditioned. And to the ego, that can feel like a death, right? Because it's almost like your allegiance, right? And certainly your identity, who and what you see and experience yourself as, is undergoing a radical change. And to the ego, that's a death, right? Because it thinks it's here, right here in the middle, directing this whole life experience, and everything pertains to it. That's what it not only believes, but that's how it feels unto itself. When a change of consciousness is just about to happen, or is in the process of happening, where that perspective is no longer going to be the dominant perspective, that change of perspective is, to the ego, often a kind of death, right? Like I said, not everybody experiences a death. Some people just sort of make the transition, and they're like, well, yeah, I guess the ego's not part of this perspective here, but I didn't really feel any huge death experience. It doesn't really matter if you experience a big ego death or not. The thing that's important is more the transition, right? To being able to experience life in a unified fashion, which, by the way, doesn't mean that in the end you completely lose your sense of individuality. You might for a while. It's more that, how can I put this? Individuality does not have to mean ego, right? Any more than an individual tree that exists on a mountainside means that tree is egoically defined. It's just its own tree, amongst many others. Individuality is sort of the unique way that life shows up as, boom, a particular, in this case, a particular human being. That's what I mean about this deeper, a more spiritual sense of individuality. It's not the way we think of individuality in this very ego-centered way, but there's also a way of that the unity, like the unity of existence appears, boom, right here, right now, as everything, but also as one particular incarnation. For here, it's here. There's one way that life is showing up. For you, life is showing up in that way, right? Now, if that's all we know, that's very limited, right? We forget the bigger sense of life, and all we have is our little ego identification. But when we reconnect, it's this sense of individuality is no longer defined by the ego or assumed to be egocentric. It's just the unique way that life shows up. But it's as much life showing up as the birds and the trees and the sky and the ground underfoot and anything else in existence, right? So just let the process happen. Just let it happen. Yeah, your ego might get a little afraid. It'll have a sort of uh, intimation of a kind of potential ego death or whatever, and you just okay. So it's a little afraid. That's all right. It's just ego death is just a change of perspective at the end of the day. Because remember, ego isn't there's not an entity in there. There's not an actual thing called an ego. We just use the name for an ego for a for particular conglomeration of experiences within the human psyche. And we call that a kind of process, which is really ego is actually a process. Then we call that process ego. But that becomes problematic because when we forget that it's just a process within the psyche, and we think the ego is an actual fundamental, stable sort of entity, and even more than that, it's what I am. That's the sort of fundamental illusion of ego. Ego is just a process. It's a perspective too. And ego death is nothing more than a shift of perspective. It can feel more dramatic than that in the transition. It's not always dramatic in the transition, but it can feel more dramatic than that. But essentially, it's just a change of perspective.